At 21 years old, Ava Mercer had already learned that life did not give warnings before it took everything from you. She had learned it the way most people learn the hardest lessons, not through someone else's story or a line in a book, but through the cold, grinding reality of losing her mother on a Tuesday afternoon in October while she was working a double shift at the Copper Kettle Diner, 40 miles from the hospital where her mother drew her last breath. She had been studying forestry at Clearwater College in Montana, the first person in her family to attend a university, paying her own tuition through financial aid, tips from the diner, and every overtime hour she could stack. Her mother, Diane Mercer, had raised her alone in a small trailer outside Bitter Hollow, working 2 jobs herself, and had told Ava every single morning that education was the one thing no one could ever repossess. Those words took on a terrible, specific meaning when the stroke came without warning, when the medical bills arrived faster than grief, and when the bank sent the notice about the trailer before the funeral flowers had even wilted. Within 4 months of burying her mother, Ava had no address. The trailer was repossessed by a lending company that showed no interest in the circumstances, only in the outstanding balance. She dropped out of her forestry program not because she wanted to, but because there was no physical place to return to between semesters, and the dorm rooms at Clearwater were not available to students who had withdrawn. She packed what she could into the back seat of her rusted 1998 Subaru hatchback, a car with 212,000 miles on it, and a heater that worked only when it felt like it, and she began a slow, quiet drift between truck stop parking lots and campground restrooms on the eastern side of the National Forest. She showered when she could afford the $3 fee at public campgrounds. She ate cheap gas station food and whatever the Copper Kettle let her take home at the end of her remaining shifts. Most people in Bitter Hollow treated her the way small towns often treat suffering when it becomes inconvenient, like background noise, something you acknowledged with a brief nod and then moved past. She was not invisible so much as deliberately overlooked, which is its own kind of loneliness. She kept her car clean. She kept her boots laced. She kept her chin up not because she felt strong, but because she had watched her mother do the same thing through financial ruin, through loneliness, through grief of her own, and she was not going to let the ground take her without a fight. She worked whatever hours the diner gave her, tucked her tips into the coffee tin her mother had kept for savings, and tried to calculate some version of a future that started from zero. But winter in Montana does not wait for you to be ready, and by December, sleeping in the hatchback behind the Pilot Travel Center off Route 9 had become genuinely dangerous. Temperatures dropped below zero on 3 consecutive nights. She kept the engine running until the gas gauge scared her, then turned it off and layered every piece of clothing she owned and prayed for dawn. It was on a rainy Tuesday in January, the kind of cold, wet gray that presses down on the mountains like a hand, that Ava walked into the Bitter Hollow Town Library to use their internet connection and warm up for an hour. She was not looking for anything in particular. She was filling out a rental assistance application that she already suspected would be rejected because you needed a current address to qualify for housing assistance, and she did not have one. It was while she was waiting for the SLO County website to load that she noticed the printed flyer pinned to the community board beside the circulation desk. It was a legal notice, formatted in small, bureaucratic font, announcing a county tax auction for several parcels of land that had accrued unpaid back taxes. Most of the listings were unremarkable, vacant lots in town, an abandoned gas station on the highway. But one entry stopped her cold. Blackwood National Forest, 12 miles east on unmarked service road, Ranger Station 14, condemned structure, no utilities, no road maintenance guaranteed, tax lien amount $18.75, opening bid $5. The photograph attached was blurry and small, printed on a library printer in faded black ink, but she could make out the shape of a 2-story structure leaning slightly to one side, a watchtower attached at the back, porch boards rotted through, windows boarded or broken. The listing described it as a condemned fire lookout station, last occupied in the late 1970s, structurally unsound, accessed only by a washed-out forest road that was not maintained by the county. There was a handwritten note below the photograph that someone had added in red ink, saying simply, "Not worth the mold." Most sensible adults would have scrolled past it. Most sensible adults had, evidently, since the auction had received no other registered bidders, as of that morning. But something about the listing pressed on a nerve Ava had not thought about in years. Something her grandfather had said at the kitchen table when she was maybe 7 years old, his voice low like he was telling a secret the walls might overhear. Her grandfather, Franklin Mercer, had worked for the U.S. Forest Service as a fire lookout in the late 1960s before a logging accident took 2 fingers from his right hand and ended his career. He was a quiet man who drank too much in his later years and died when Ava was 12. But she remembered with startling clarity a night he had leaned forward over a plate of biscuits and said, "Station 14, that place up in Blackwood, there's something buried in that ground that certain people would rather you never find." Her mother had changed the subject. Ava had filed it away in the part of her memory labeled things adults say when they've had a drink. Now she pulled that memory back out and looked at it differently. She checked her coffee tin when she got back to the car. $18.42. The opening bid was $5. She sat in the cold front seat for a long time listening to rain hammer the roof, turning the flyer over in her hands, thinking about the kind of logic that applied when you had nothing left to lose. She was already sleeping in a parking lot. She was already paying $3 a night for shower access. A condemned building 12 miles into wolf country with no road and no power was, technically, more of a structure than what she currently had. She drove to the county assessor's office before it closed and registered her bid with $5 pulled from the coffee tin in exact change. The clerk, a heavy-set man with reading glasses on a chain, looked at the form and then looked at her and allowed himself a small smirk. "You just bought yourself a pile of mold," he said, sliding the receipt across the counter. Ava folded it and tucked it into her jacket pocket without a word. 3 days later, on a Friday morning when the temperature had climbed above freezing for the first time in 2 weeks, Ava loaded the hatchback with everything useful she owned, which amounted to a sleeping bag, a small camp stove, a box of tools she had collected from thrift stores over the past year, a flashlight, a crowbar, rope, 2 jugs of water, and 6 days' worth of canned goods. She drove the 12 miles into Blackwood on a road that the county had clearly not graded since the Clinton administration. The hatchback bottomed out twice on washed-out sections. She had to get out and move a fallen pine branch that had been lying across the track long enough to grow moss. When she finally reached the clearing where Station 14 sat, she turned off the engine and simply stared through the windshield for a long moment. The photographs had been accurate, but somehow insufficient. The building was worse in person in some ways. The porch had not just rotted, but partially collapsed on the south end. One of the watchtower windows gaped open to the sky. The roof over the back half of the main structure had caved inward under the weight of accumulated snow and time. Vines had grown up through the broken foundation and wrapped themselves around the porch columns like the forest was slowly reclaiming the building cell by cell. The front door hung at an angle from a single hinge, and yet the walls were standing. The stone chimney was intact. The main structure, despite the partial roof collapse, had a front half that appeared solid. Ava got out of the car, stood in the clearing in the cold morning air, and felt something she had not felt in months. It was not happiness exactly. It was more like recognition. Like meeting something that had been waiting for you without you knowing you were expected. She spent the first day making the main room livable in the most basic sense. She swept debris with a branch, cleared the collapsed interior wall sections enough to identify which parts of the structure were safe, stacked old fallen ceiling boards against the exterior to act as a windbreak, and lit the rusted iron stove in the corner using Ranger manuals she found stacked on a shelf, their yellowed pages catching quickly. The stove worked. That was the first unexpected gift. That night the rain came back, leaking through the still open sections of the roof in thin, cold streams, and Ava slept in her sleeping bag on the floor near the stove with her boots on and her crowbar within reach. And she slept more soundly than she had in 4 months, because for the first time in 4 months, she was inside something that belonged to her. On the second morning, she began the process of actually assessing the building, moving room to room with her flashlight and her notebook, recording what was damaged, what was intact, what could be salvaged. She worked her way into the basement storage room in the early afternoon, a low-ceilinged space off the back of the main room, accessible through a door that had swollen in its frame and required her full weight to open. The room smelled of mildew and something older, something mineral and dense. She had expected to find old equipment, maybe rusted tools or deteriorated boxes. What she found instead, after she had pulled away 3 sections of rotten wooden shelving from the far wall, were the scrape marks on the concrete floor. They were not random. She crouched down with her flashlight aimed low and traced them with her eyes. Parallel grooves, evenly spaced, the pattern of something heavy having been dragged back and forth repeatedly over many years. The marks converged beneath an old steel equipment cabinet, the kind with 4 drawers and a body heavy enough that Ava needed both arms and her full body weight to drag it sideways across the floor. Beneath it, concealed in a shallow recess that had been cut deliberately into the concrete and then filled back in with a thin layer of poured cement to disguise the seam, was an iron hatch roughly 3 feet square, set flush with the floor, sealed with a combination padlock that had oxidized so severely the shackle had fused to the body. Ava sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. Her first practical thought was that it was a Cold War-era emergency shelter, the kind the Forest Service had occasionally installed in remote stations during the 1950s as a precaution against nuclear emergency. Her second thought, arriving a moment behind the first like a quieter voice, was that something had been deliberately hidden here by someone who expected it to stay hidden. The Forest Service emblem stamped into the iron surface of the hatch had been scratched at methodically with something sharp, not worn away by age, but actively defaced. Someone had spent real time trying to remove that marking. She got her crowbar. She got her hammer. She spent the better part of 2 hours working the padlock, and when it finally burst open with a sound like a gunshot echoing off the basement walls, she held her flashlight over the dark opening and looked down into a ladder disappearing into the ground, and felt the cold air rise up past her face, carrying the smell of old paper and machine oil and something metallic she could not name. The room at the bottom of the ladder was not what she had expected. It was not a survival shelter with cots and canned water. It was, unmistakably, a workspace, an operations room. The ceiling was low, but the room itself extended further back than the footprint of the building above should have allowed, which meant whoever built it had excavated sideways into the hillside. Shelves lined 3 walls from floor to ceiling, holding filing cabinets and wooden crates and stacks of cardboard boxes wrapped in plastic that had kept out the moisture remarkably well. A long table ran down the center of the room with a surface covered in maps, each one laminated or sealed under sheets of clear plastic, held flat by wooden slats nailed along the edges. 2 old radio units sat in the corner, their dials and switches filmed with dust, but otherwise intact. A row of hooks near the ladder held faded orange Forest Service jackets and a hard hat with the number 14 stamped on the brim. Ava stood at the bottom of the ladder and turned slowly, taking it all in, and felt the particular quality of stillness that belongs to places where something important happened, and then stopped abruptly. She moved to the nearest shelf and opened the first filing cabinet. Inside, in hanging folders arranged by year, were journals. Dozens of them, composition notebooks with marbled covers, labeled in precise handwriting on the front cover. E. Vance, Chief Ranger, Blackwood Station 14, and a year. The earliest was dated 1968. The latest was 1977. She lifted the final journal from its folder, carried it to the table under her flashlight beam, and opened it. Elias Vance wrote the way a man writes when he is trying to set something down accurately, because he believes the accuracy matters, not floridly, not with dramatic flourish, but with the careful specificity of someone who understood that details are what survive when everything else is disputed. The early entries described routine station life, weather observations, fire watch rotations, wildlife logs, the kind of administrative record-keeping a ranger was required to maintain. But by 1971, the tone shifted. Vance began writing about what he was seeing in the forest itself, sections of protected old-growth timber that had been cleared without permits, equipment tracks on ridgelines that had no authorized access, fires that started in patterns inconsistent with lightning or camper negligence. He wrote, in an entry dated March of 1972, "Third time this season I've reported unauthorized clearing on the North Ridge to the district office. Third time I've received no response. I have begun to wonder if the silence from below is not oversight but instruction." Ava read through the night. She did not notice the cold. She did not notice the time. She worked through every journal in sequence, following the thread of what Elias Vance had uncovered over 9 years with the methodical patience of a man who knew he was alone in knowing it. By 1973, he had identified the principal actors, a consortium of private timber companies operating under shell subsidiaries, a network of county and state officials receiving payments to suppress environmental reviews and overlook logging violations, and at least 3 wildfires that Vance believed were deliberately set to clear protected land so that development contracts could proceed without the legal obstruction of standing old-growth timber. He named names. He documented dates. And then, around 1975, his tone shifted again into something quieter and more frightened. He wrote about being followed on the forest road, about someone entering the station while he was on watch in the tower, about a visit from a county official who told him, with careful friendliness, that his upcoming performance review would reflect whatever conclusions he chose to put in his official reports. Ava set down the final journal and opened the locked cabinets on the back wall. The locks on these were newer than the hatch lock, a detail she noted with the part of her brain that had been trained in evidence-based forestry assessment and now was applying itself to something else entirely. Inside the first cabinet were photographs, dozens of them, black and white and early color prints, showing logging equipment in protected zones, showing men she did not recognize posed near machinery with corporate insignia, showing cleared hillsides where old-growth forest had stood. Inside the second cabinet were signed contracts between timber companies and county departments, bank ledgers showing payments to individual officials, and manila envelopes containing audio cassette tapes labeled by date and participant, the word recorded written in Vance's hand on each label. Inside the third cabinet were maps cross-referenced with the journals, showing the exact coordinates of cleared areas, burn zones, access roads cut illegally through federal land. And there, in a separate folder inside the third cabinet, was a list of names. Officials, executives, intermediaries. Some she recognized as old Bitter Hollow family names. One she recognized with a physical jolt because it was the grandfather of the current mayor of Bitter Hollow, a man named Garrett Holloway who had been photographed shaking hands at the ribbon cutting of the new county courthouse 3 months earlier. Ava stood in the underground room at 3 in the morning holding a signed check made out to Gerald Holloway dated August of 1974, drawn from a shell company account, and she understood with sudden and total clarity why Station 14 had been allowed to quietly rot into the forest floor for 40 years. She found the final journal entry, dated August 11th, 1977, and read it slowly. Vance had written, "If anyone finds this station after me, understand this was not greed alone. These mountains contain mineral deposits of considerable value, and those who wanted ownership of that land were willing to burn it, bury it, and silence anyone who stood in the way. Trust no county official. Take this somewhere the weight of it cannot be quietly absorbed." 4 days later, after she had spent 2 days making handwritten inventories of every document and 3 trips back and forth to Bitter Hollow to use the library scanner and copy machine, Ava sat in the library with her inventory complete and began her research. The mineral Vance had referenced in the later journals, described only by chemical properties and geological survey notations, took her 40 minutes to identify through cross-referencing with current geological databases. It was terbium, a rare earth element with a distinctive magnetic signature, used in military-grade electronics, advanced sonar systems, and the kind of solid-state devices that had become foundational to modern technology. Vance had been writing about terbium deposits in the 1970s when it was a curiosity with limited applications. By the present day, it had become one of the most strategically valuable minerals on Earth. She found a geological survey from 11 years earlier confirming that Blackwood Ridge sat directly above what geologists estimated to be one of the largest untapped terbium deposits in North America, with an estimated extraction value of over $200 million. She sat with that number for a moment. Then she thought about the phone in her pocket with its cracked screen and the $18 left in her tin after the auction bid. And she thought about the hatch in the basement floor. And she thought about Elias Vance riding alone in an underground room in 1977 while someone was following him on the forest road. She made 2 copies of everything on the library scanner. She mailed one set in a padded envelope to the office of the Montana State Attorney General, addressed to the Public Records Division, with a cover letter describing what she had found and where. She kept the second set in a waterproof bag she tucked under the floorboard of the hatchback. Then she drove back to Station 14. The calls began the next morning. A number she did not recognize, calling 4 times in succession before leaving a voicemail that identified the caller as an attorney representing a development company called Ridgecrest Holdings, expressing interest in purchasing the property and any associated structures, asking her to call back at her earliest convenience. 2 hours later, a different number, this one belonging to a woman who introduced herself as a representative from the Bitter Hollow County Planning Office, who said, with a warmth that felt constructed rather than genuine, that she wanted to make sure Ava had all the paperwork in order for the purchase, as these things could get complicated, and that the county would be happy to help her navigate any confusion. Then, just before noon, a black SUV appeared at the end of the washed-out service road, idling for 20 minutes before turning around. Ava watched it from the watchtower with her grandfather's binoculars, which she had kept through every move because they were the one possession from him she had never been able to release. That night, someone broke into the station. She heard them through the floorboards of the main room, 2 sets of footsteps in the basement, moving carefully, and she lay still in her sleeping bag near the stove and made herself breathe slowly, her hand on the crowbar, listening. They were down there for perhaps 30 minutes. She heard drawers being opened. She heard the sound of the hatch being found, the ladder creaking. She heard, eventually, the tone of someone who has looked for something and found it gone. The footsteps came back up the ladder, and after another 10 minutes the sound of a vehicle engine started down the road. Ava waited another hour, then climbed down into the underground room with her flashlight. The filing cabinets had been forced open. Papers were scattered, but the originals she had already removed and copied were safe in padded envelopes in a post office box in town. A box she had rented for $4.50 that afternoon with money borrowed from a waitress at the Copper Kettle who had always been kind to her. She had already contacted a journalist. Her name was Renata Osei, an investigative reporter for a regional paper called the Mountain Record who had a reputation for not being easily intimidated. Ava had found her name through a search for journalists who had previously covered Forest Service corruption cases, and she had emailed her from the library computer with a subject line that read, "I have 40 years of buried evidence from a condemned ranger station, and I need to know you're the right person before I send it." Renata had responded within 2 hours. They met in a coffee shop in Missoula the following morning, Ava arriving with the waterproof bag and a copy of the inventory list, Renata arriving with a voice recorder and the specific quality of alertness that belongs to people who have been waiting a long time for a story that matters. The story broke 3 weeks later, not in the Mountain Record alone, but through a wire service pickup that carried it to national outlets within 48 hours, because the combination of rare mineral deposits, 40 years of documented government corruption, arson evidence, and a 21-year-old homeless woman who had bought the key to all of it for $5 was the kind of story that writes its own headline. Federal investigators from the Department of Justice and the Forest Service Office of Inspector General arrived in Bitter Hollow within 10 days of publication. The county planning office was placed under review. Mayor Garrett Holloway, whose grandfather's signed checks appeared in the evidence, said Ava had mailed to the Attorney General, resigned before formal charges were filed. 2 former state officials were indicted on corruption charges related to the land seizures. The timber company records Vance had documented led to a civil case that would wind through the courts for years, but began with asset freezes that wiped out fortunes that had been built quietly on the back of crimes committed against public land. In the weeks after the story broke, Ava was contacted by lawyers, by journalists, by 3 separate documentary production companies, and by a professor of environmental law at the University of Montana who wanted to discuss the legal implications of her ownership claim. It was this last conversation that led to the most unexpected development of all. The professor, a compact woman named Dr. Adiz Nwosu, who had been practicing land and mineral rights law for 20 years, reviewed the original county deed and the auction paperwork, and then spent 2 days reviewing Montana forestry legislation before calling Ava back with the particular careful tone of someone trying not to get ahead of themselves. "There is a clause," Dr. Nwosu said, "in a 1931 Forestry Land Management Act, a provision that was written to protect homesteaders and has never been formally repealed, that under specific conditions allows a valid deed transfer of condemned forest-adjacent structures to carry attached mineral extraction rights for the surrounding land parcel, provided the original parcel boundaries were set before federal reclassification. Station 14's parcel boundaries had been set in 1929. The legal proceedings that followed were not simple or quick. Nothing about mineral rights law is either of those things, and Ava spent the better part of 18 months in consultation with Dr. Nwosu and a team of attorneys who worked on a contingency basis once the scope of the potential claim became clear. There were challenges, counterfilings, and 2 attempts by Ridgecrest Holdings to claim prior interest in the mineral deposits through a subsidiary that had been quietly incorporated decades earlier specifically to hold those claims in dormancy. But the documentation Vance had left in the underground room, including the signed contracts showing that the original land surveys had been falsified to exclude the mineral-rich parcels from federal protection, ultimately undermined every counterclaim. The falsification of the surveys meant the federal reclassification that would have voided the 1931 clause had never been properly executed. The homeless girl who had spent 4 months sleeping in a parking lot owned, through a deed she had purchased for $5 from a smirking county clerk, a partial land claim against one of the most valuable rare earth deposits in North America. The settlement, when it came, was not $200 million. Ava had never expected it to be, and the attorneys had been careful not to let the numbers in the geological surveys become the number she organized her expectations around. The final figure, arrived at after months of negotiation between her legal team, the federal government, and the mining company that ultimately won the extraction contract, was enough to fund the purchase and full restoration of Station 14, enough to return to Clearwater College and finish her forestry degree without financial worry. Enough to establish a conservation fund in the name of Elias Vance that would work to protect old-growth forest land in Montana in perpetuity. It was not a lottery win. It was something that felt more real than that, more earned, more connected to something that had been set in motion long before she was born. It was on the day the restoration of Station 14 was nearly complete, a cold October morning 3 years after she had first climbed down into that underground room with a flashlight taped to her wrist, that Ava found the photograph. She had been going through the last items from Elias Vance's personal desk, a roll-top piece that had been moved carefully to storage during the renovation and was now being returned to the office on the main floor. Inside the smallest drawer, tucked into an envelope that had been sealed with a strip of aging tape that had dried and curled but held, was a black and white photograph. It showed Elias Vance in his Forest Service uniform, younger than she had imagined him, standing in front of Station 14 in what looked like early summer. Beside him stood a young woman in a cotton dress, holding a baby, squinting slightly against the sun in the way people do when they are happy and not particularly concerned with how they appear. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting she recognized from 9 years of journals, Vance had written, "For Clara's granddaughter. If she ever comes back to the mountain, tell her family this place was always waiting for her." Clara was her grandmother's name. Ava Mercer, who had died before Ava was old enough to really know her, who had met Franklin Mercer, who had worked with Elias Vance, who had in some way been part of the story of Station 14 decades before Ava had ever seen a flyer on a library bulletin board. Ava stood in the restored office holding the photograph for a long time, the October light coming through windows that were now whole and clear, the stove ticking in the corner where it had always been, the mountain forest pressing green and dense against the glass. She thought about the chain of things that had brought her here, the death and the debt, and the parking lot winters, and the $5 bid, and the smirking clerk, and the scrape marks on the basement floor, and the cold air rising from the open hatch, and the journals of a man who had trusted the truth to outlast the people who wanted it buried. She thought about her grandfather leaning over biscuits, saying Station 14 in a low voice, as though the name itself had weight. She understood now that it did. Some places carry the weight of what was done in them, and what was left unfinished, and they hold that weight patient and silent until the person meant to lift it finally arrives. Ava Mercer had arrived at 21 with $18.42 and a crowbar and a sleeping bag, and the mountain had been waiting the whole time. If this story moved you, subscribe right now, because tomorrow we have something waiting for you that will make you believe even harder that the right doors open for the people meant to walk through them.